This is the Pit Stop. Hi, I'm Tom Pitt, and from a very early age, I've driven cars with tires so thin you can see the air inside them. Lots and lots of issues. At that point, I decided I needed to do something about it and become an automotive technician. In this episode of the Pit Stop, I'm going to share some of my automotive knowledge with you about brakes. The first step in the process of changing brakes on a vehicle is going to be to lift the car up. The car has to be off the ground so that we can remove the wheels. Now, not everyone's going to have a two-post lift at their home. We're doing this just to give you a little bit easier view of what's taking place. You can use a floor jack and a jack stand. Never use just a floor jack. Always use a safety jack stand. With the vehicle secure, our next step is to remove the wheel. With the wheel off, we can remove the slide bolts from the caliper. With these bolts removed, this caliper will come off fairly easily. Now, it's important to remember not to let this caliper, this part, hang from this rubber hose. It can cause damage to it. The best way to do this is to suspend it with a piece of wire. So after the wire is hooked to this caliper, I would wrap it around the top part of this spring so it's suspended. That way we have slack in this hose and it's not going to put tension on it, it's not going to break it. With the caliper out of the way, you can remove the rotor. It's not really bolted on, it doesn't have any way of staying on except for with the wheel and this caliper mount. If you have a rotor that looks like this, that needs to be addressed. It needs to be either machined or replaced. Machining a rotor is not something that just anybody can do. It needs to go to a parts place or professional automotive shop. Now this car is one that's owned by the school, so it's never going to be back on the road. We're not going to put new rotors on it, we're not going to machine these, but I will show you how to reinstall. We'll line the holes up with the wheel studs, we'll slide that back on. Some rotors are going to have holes right here for machine screws to go in. If those are in there, I'm going to recommend you leave those out. You don't want to put those back in because when the bolts go through here and into this hub, when it gets really hot, it expands. When it gets cold, it contracts. And a lot of times those machine screws are going to be stuck into this hub. And I've actually had to break rotors to get those off. So I'm never going to put one of those machine screws back in. On this particular vehicle, after you remove the caliper, you'll remove a set of pins to get these pads out. Not all of them are like that. Some have clips and some just have springs holding them in. Now on this vehicle, the brake pads really weren't that bad. If we look at the friction material, which is the raised part, compared to the backing plate, a good rule of thumb is that if that friction material is thinner than the backing plate, the brakes should be replaced. In this case, just because we're doing this for a demonstration, we're going to put these pads back in. To do that, we will place these one against the piston and one against the backside, the sliding part of the caliper, and we'll install these pins. Since we're not necessarily replacing parts, there are going to be a few things that we're going to omit during this, but I'll go ahead and explain those to you right now. If you'll remember, one of our previous videos where we put anti-seize on spark plugs to make sure they didn't seize up, we're going to use the same stuff and we're going to do the same thing on our brake components. And we're going to put these on parts that come in contact with other metal parts, but we're not going to put this on parts that come in contact with the brake friction material or the rotor. One more step is when you install new pads, they're going to be a little bit thicker than the old ones. And so it's moved the piston up just a little bit on this caliper. To install a caliper with new pads, you really need to go ahead and compress that piston. With everything ready to go back together, we can remove the wire from the middle of this caliper. And we can set our caliper on our rotor. With our caliper in place, we're ready to put our slide bolts back in. With everything else tightened and torqued down, you may notice that the rotor is still flopping around here, and lots of folks have issues with that. It's not a big deal because the wheel will be installed over top and the lugs will hold this rotor firmly in place. So with our brakes installed, our final step is to install the wheel. We'll place this over the wheel studs. Now, it's important to note that the wheel that we're putting on here, that's a temporary spare tire. And that's not something that you're going to use every day on the highway. We had an issue with this tire and just had to replace this. This is a shop car, one that goes in and out of the shop for demonstration purposes, so it's not that big a deal going in and out of the parking lot. We'll snug these by hand, and then we'll set the vehicle on the ground and we'll tighten the lugs with a torque wrench. So I'm going to adjust our torque wrench to set the torque rating at 90 foot-pounds. That's the manufacturer's specification for these wheels. And with the torque wrench, we'll tighten until we hear one click. So now we're done, right? Well, not really. Before we move the vehicle, we need to make sure that we pump the brakes to build up the brake fluid pressure. Let's go to the driver's seat for that. After pumping the brake pedal, I can tell you now that these brakes are no longer broke. Well, with our brakes fixed, looks like it's time for our show to come to a stop. Get it? Anyway, that's all we have time for today. Until next time, I'm Tom Pitt, reminding you to keep it between the lines and the shiny side up. It's time for our show to come to a stop. Looks like that's all the time we have. Looks like that's all the time we have for. We'll start again. Temporary spare, and it's not to be driven on the highway under normal.